Welcome back to another episode of the Legal Lowdown. I'm your host, Matthew R. Carpenter, an attorney, and today we are digging into some recent SEC enforcement actions, specifically from the week leading into July 14th, 2025. We've got three main flavors of financial trouble on the menu today: insider trading, offerings fraud, and selling unregistered securities. For those of you who are new to the securities world, think of insider trading like maybe getting a sneak peek at the final exam answers before you walk into class on the day of the test. And offerings fraud, that's like being promised, I don't know, a luxury cruise, but ending up on that leaky little door that Rose used in Titanic to save herself. Excuse me, sorry. And selling unregistered securities. Well, maybe think of that as like trying to sell a bridge that hasn't been approved by the local authorities, or just a bridge that you don't even own. Okay, and these cases that we're going to dig into today, they highlight each of these themes. They look different on the surface, but digging a little deeper, you often find the same core issues. It's about dishonesty. It's about breaking trust, people, which is a huge deal in the finance world because our economic system is all about trust. Once you understand that, then you just have to familiarize yourself with the patterns of economic fraud or dishonesty, and you'll be well on your way to understanding these securities enforcement actions, which are a huge part of the white-collar crime world. And understanding this stuff isn't just for lawyers and finance pros. It's really crucial for you, the listener, to help protect yourself and just to make sense of the market noise out there. So let's get into the specifics of these cases. Let's start with insider trading. Spicy stuff. We've got SEC versus Vakil first. So this case was recently filed and comes to us from the Southern District of New York. It's actually pretty sad. Defendant Akil, who was a senior director for Elanco Animal Health, was assigned to organize a deal in which Elanco would purchase another company called Kindred Bioscience. After Vakil was assigned to the deal, though, she bought shares in Kindred Bioscience. Why? Because she knew the deal would shoot Kindred's stock price way up. And after Vakil got her shares, she then tipped off her friend, Defendant Vizent, to do the same. And the reason I say this is sad is because both Vakil and Vizent were caught and are now being prosecuted civilly and criminally, but Vakil only made $2,400 from the insider trading. Meanwhile, Vizent came up on roughly $100,000. In the end, they both pleaded guilty to criminal charges. In the civil case, the SEC brought claims under Section 10B of the Exchange Act and Rule 10b-5, which basically punishes anyone who engages in any act, practice, or course of business which operates or would operate as fraud or deceit in connection with the purchase or sale of a security. Okay, that's SEC versus Vakil, serious stuff. So moving on to offerings fraud, we saw, kind of a depressing mix this week in this category too. Different schemes, but the same basic playbook. The play doesn't change, bruh. The play doesn't change. Exploiting trust is the move in our next case. This one, SEC versus Fernandez, comes to us from the Northern District of West Virginia, where the SEC brought civil claims against defendant Fernandez for defrauding investors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Allegedly, from 2018 to 2020, defendant Fernandez collected more than $300,000 by telling unwitting investors that she was an experienced businesswoman with a fail-proof short-term investment plan that could get them serious gains at virtually no risk. Of course, this turned out to be false, and defendant Fernandez actually used her ill-gotten gains to support her personal lifestyle. She was caught and slapped with criminal charges, which she pleaded guilty to. And the SEC hit her with civil claims as well under Section 10B of the Exchange Act, as well as Section 17A of the Securities Act, which punishes people who participate in the fraudulent offering and sale of securities. Okay, our next offerings fraud case is SEC versus Jackson, which comes to us from the Eastern District of Texas. This case is actually a bit alarming because the defendants didn't really do anything crazy to wow investors, but still somehow duped them out of 2.6 million schmeckles. So long story short, defendant Jackson finessed investors over a period of 2-ish years from 2019 to 2021 by telling them that you can invest their money in real estate. The investors were supposed to get their money back and on top of that receive a monthly payment in the form of interest. Sounds rather reasonable if you ask me, but of course, there was no real estate investment. And defendant Jackson pocketed the money for himself. The SEC caught wind and brought Section 10B claims as well as Section 17A claims. Very popular claims nowadays. The case is ongoing. Okay, now turning to our third and final offering fraud case, SEC versus Palazzo, which comes to us from the Northern District of California. In this case, defendant Palazzo, who was a Harvard football player and alumni, persuaded unwitting financiers to invest in two schemes. The first was called Stack scheme because defendant Palazzo told investors he had $4 million and only needed another million to purchase a sports media company called Stack that would pay returns over time to the investors. The investors, trusting Mr. Palazzo, of course, contributed more than $900,000 to the plan. But you know how this goes, people. Defendant Palazzo did not have the other $4 million to buy the Stack company, which he actually owned and sold before the investment scheme started. Oh, and defendant Palazzo had no intention of even buying the company at all. But that's not all. Defendant Palazzo had another scheme called the play calling scheme, where over the span of 3 years, he told investors he needed more than $2 million to launch a sports betting operation. The catch, you might ask? There was no sports betting operation, guys. There just wasn't. And instead, defendant Palazzo used the $2.1 million he raised to pay personal expenses and fund his luxurious lifestyle. The SEC got wise and brought civil claims under Section 10B and 17A. Defendant Palazzo eventually settled and is enjoined from serving as a director or officer and is also required to pay nearly $2.8 million disgorgement civil penalties. It's kind of wild how frequently these defendants immediately choose to spend the money on themselves instead of at least trying to follow through on the original investment. Like, if you put all this energy just into valid investments instead, you might succeed. And what strikes me about these offering frauds is just the range, from a few $100,000 to millions. Different stories, different sectors, different strokes, different folks, but the core mechanism is identical. Take investor money based on false pretenses and use it for yourself. Classic con, just dressed up differently each time. Okay, so wrapping up, let's end with the unregistered shares segment of cases, I promise. And in this category, the main case is SEC versus Rosenbaum. This case was filed in early July and comes to us from the Northern District of Texas. The case is quite interesting. It involves 3 CEOs, a disbarred attorney, and a securities fraud mastermind, 5 defendants in all. Long story short, the 5 defendants made $112 million in a pump and dump scheme. Classic pump and dump for investors by misleading the investors about the value of a microcap stock company. They did this by filing fraudulent finance statements signed by the 3 CEOs, and they also used nearly 100 attorney opinion letters written by the disbarred attorney to encourage investment. For those of you who don't know, the very purpose of attorney opinion letters is to instill confidence in investors. The letters basically say the company is in good standing, that the assets are legitimate, and that the securities comply with all applicable laws and regulations. Of course, since the attorney opinion letters in this case came from an attorney who was disbarred, you can probably guess those representations were not true. And in the end, once the defendants were able to raise that $112 million, they cashed in on it and tried to skip town. But the SEC was all over them like back pockets and slapped them with Section 10 and 17A claims. The defendants ultimately settled, which resulted in injunctions and disgorgement on each defendant in the amount of $22 million. So, having a disbarred attorney issue attorney opinion letters and CEOs signing iffy disclosures, that points to a pretty deliberate breakdown in this system of trust. The very people meant to be the gatekeepers of trust, potentially enabling fraud on the flip side of the coin. That really raises questions like, who is watching these people? Where are they mamas at? It shows how complex these schemes can get. Layering deceit upon deceit, often relying on that veneer of legitimacy that comes with legal or corporate structures and titles, right? Cold world. So, okay, let's boil this down. What's the takeaway for you listening? We've seen insider tips turn small gains into big ones. We've seen outright lies about investments, funding personal spending sprees, and shady dealings with unregistered shares involving professionals who should know better. Yeah, and if you zoom out, it just hammers home the need for constant vigilance. That is always going to be the conclusion in these cases, people. It's like, you can be protected by the securities laws as much as you think that you are, right? But in practice, the best person to protect you is yourself, right? So critical thinking is key. These cases are a stark, staunch reminder that while tactics might change, the fundamentals of honesty and transparency in finance, right, they're just non-negotiable. You need those things. There's always something new happening, a new angle. But applying these basic principles helps navigate it all. So stay sharp out there. Stay sharp, people. And thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Legal Lowdown. Hopefully, I gave you some food for thought, maybe a new lens for these new financial headlines. And as you think about this, maybe consider what kind of vulnerabilities you think fraudsters might exploit next. Until next time, take care.